Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. You're watching a Monroe Forensic Actuaries webinar coming to you live from Cape Town, where I've got no idea what it looks like outside because I've been locked inside for 2 weeks like all of you. I am your host, Eddie, and I'm here in Cape Town, as I said, and I think I'll just talk a little bit and tell you a bit about myself while we wait for the other people to join in. And I'm just going to have a look here to see how many of them have joined. We're at quite a few already. So I am married to Christine. We've got 2 boys, Daniel and David. They are 5 and 7, and they're keeping us nice and busy during this lockdown period. There's been cricket clinics, there's been rugby clinics, there's been swimming clinics, there's been lots of clinics. So I'm hoping that is going to take away some of that energy that they seem to just always have. Talking about cricket, and while we're waiting for a few more people to join before we officially start, I'm going to let you in on a little office joke that goes something like, I look a little bit like Sean Pollock, and my colleague Dean, who you're going to be seeing a bit later, looks a little bit like Australian cricketer Mitchell Johnson. So if you have just joined, welcome. You have joined the Let's Talk Cricket show, and this is your host, Sean and Mitch. So let's just go back and have a look and see how many people we are. I think we are just about good to go. Okay, so let me introduce myself properly this time. If you've just joined, welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is the 4th in a series of webinars that we are hosting. We call it the Uncertainty Series, in this alluding to this uncertain times that we are in at the moment. And a little bit more about myself. Eddie Teron is my name. I'm an actuary here at Monroe. I've been working here for about 4 years. Before that, I started off spending some time overseas. I was at Old Mutual for about 12 years, and then joined Monroe. I'm also going to be handing over to my colleague Dean later in the presentation, but I'll let him introduce himself a bit later. And then one of my other colleagues, Anna Marie, is going to be looking at the question and answers that, or the questions that you might have, and answering them. You'll see at the bottom, or maybe at the top of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. So you're welcome to leave your questions there as we go on. There's also a chat button. So if there's any other things that you want to let us know, or maybe you're struggling with the connection or anything like that, please just pop us a message there and we can get back to you. So you will be, as a participant, you'll be muted, both your voice and your video. So we are not going to be able to hear you or see you. That's just to make sure that we don't have any buffering issues. But as I said, if you want to make yourselves known, then use the chat or the Q&A. At the end of the session, when you leave, you're going to be taken to a survey. And if I could please ask you to complete that survey, it just really helps us to get your feedback and for us to figure out how we can continue to serve you excellently. Okay. It looks like there's a few more people that have joined, so I'm gonna get stuck in. So the topic that I'm going to cover today is how we as actuaries deal with uncertainty when instructions are vague. And the type of instructions, just for context a little bit, the type of instructions that we're talking about here are any damages claim where there's been a requirement to do actuarial calculation. But in my presentation, I'm specifically more going to be talking about loss of earnings claims, and the type of instructions that we're talking about is going to be are going to be industrial psychologist instructions. So I'm hoping that this webinar is going to be insightful for you, and I'm assuming that our audiences are mostly attorneys. So I'm hoping that this presentation and webinar is going to help you in the way that you communicate back to your IPs. At the end of the presentation, we're going to be sharing exciting new development. We've been working hard to produce a online visualization tool, which is going to help IPs visualize the earnings progressions and their postulations. So make sure to stay on until the end of the presentation. So the topics that I'm going to cover is misunderstandings around the wordings of possible and probable. And the second one is going to be talking about direct and indirect losses. We're then going to look at earnings projections that does not make sense. And then, as I said, we're going to be ending off with showing you the earnings assistant. And then I'll leave some time for us to answer some questions that you might have. Okay. So possible versus probable misunderstandings. I've got no idea who actually said this, but I've heard it said that you should say what you mean what you say, and don't say it mean. So in a world where we've got actuaries and attorneys and industrial psychologists working together, it's very possible that we might say the same things but actually mean something a little bit different. So this issue of possible and probable has been dealt with in a Robert Koch newsletter in the past. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about what it says there. But basically, for us actuaries, if you look at the circle on the left, the word probability means a percentage. So a percentage that could be between 1 or 100%. In legal speak, a probability usually means something that's got a chance of greater than 50%. And a possibility is something that has less than a 50% chance of happening. So some industrial psychologists sometimes use the word possible to mean probable, which you can understand leads to some issues. So I think that the takeout is just that we all need to be clear and understand what we mean when we say possible or probable. So to give a little bit of a visual illustration to this, you'll recognize this graph from the reports that we send out. And the black line is the uninjured earnings progression. In this case, quite a simple one. The claimant, the accident was in 2015. He was earning 10,000 Rand a month. And then from the date of accident, there's a progression to earning 20,000 Rand a month at age 50. And in the injured earnings, it's just showing that injured earnings is increasing with earnings inflation up to early retirement. So when we say that it's probable that the earnings would increase from 10,000 to 20,000, for us actuaries, that means there's a 100% chance of that happening. So it results in this picture as we see it here. However, if our instruction says that there's a 50% chance that the uninjured earnings increase to 20,000 Rand, to us that means 50% of the increase is 10,000 Rand. So a 5% increase, which leads to earnings of 15,000 Rand. Then on the other spectrum, if our instruction is that it is possible that the earnings would have progressed to 20,000 Rand, then we interpret that to say that there's a 0% probability attached to that, meaning that there's no progression. So the conclusion really is that IPs should be intentional about the wording they use and specifically state what they want us to calculate. So we're now going to move on. Excuse me for a second. We're now going to move on to direct versus indirect losses and how contingencies are used in those cases. My colleague Charles Duplessis did a webinar on contingent, or specifically going into more detail around contingencies yesterday. And I'm only going to cover this in a more high level. If you're interested to have a look at that, please email us. We are recording these webinars, and you are welcome to request that we send you a copy of that recording. So what do we mean with a direct and an indirect loss? A direct loss is where an industrial psychologist gives us a very clear indication of what the injured earnings are going to be for a claimant, and therefore we are very sure what the injured or what the loss is going to be. So examples of that could be that the claimant will retire 5 years earlier, or that the claimant is unemployable, or that the claimant will not reach a pre-accident career ceiling. When it comes to indirect losses, the wording that might be used by IPs could be something like the claimant might retire early, or the claimant might suffer periods of unemployment, or the claimant might not be promoted due to the accident. And the wording that we then often encounter there is that there's no clear loss, but that losses should be dealt with on a contingency basis. So again, if we visualize this into the same earnings progression picture that I showed earlier, this is the same scenario that I showed in the other slide. The direct loss is clear here. There's no earnings progression. The earnings only increase with earnings inflation, and there's early retirement at age 60 as opposed to age 65. So the loss that we can see there is the gray area, but below the black line and above the gray line. So it's clear from just looking at this picture that there is a loss in this case. Whereas if we were to think about indirect loss, the picture would look like this. You won't even see the black line because the gray line, the injured earnings, is now exactly the same as the uninjured earnings. And there's therefore no loss, and any loss should then be calculated by using contingencies. So if we look at the figures that these two scenarios produce, the top calculation is the direct loss, which results in a loss of around 1.5 million. The bottom calculation is where there's no direct loss, there's an indirect loss. And if we then calculate a loss based on a 10% contingency differential, which is the standard contingency differential that we see in our reports, then that loss only comes to an amount of 400,000, or just below 400,000. So you can see there's a massive difference between the losses calculated in the direct loss scenario and the indirect loss scenario. So again, this is where we're hoping that this tool that we're developing, or we have developed, the earnings assistant, is going to be able to help industrial psychologists visualize the earnings progressions that they are postulating. And our hope is that it's going to give them confidence to not merely say that losses can't be calculated directly and that it should be done via contingencies, but that they would be able to then have more confidence in producing a direct loss postulation, which in our view should result in a fairer outcome as opposed to a random contingency-based loss calculation. And I'm now going to just move to a very basic practical example of a earnings progression that does not make sense. and then again use this as a introduction into this earnings assistant tool that we've developed. So if I can just talk you through the table at the top of this slide. This is a similar progression to what we've seen earlier. There's a claimant that was in an accident in 2010. He was earning 10,000 Rand per month at that stage. In 2010 terms, and in this case, the industrial psychologist is postulating that he's increased in his uninjured state, his earnings in his uninjured state would have increased to 12,000 Rand per month in 2015, in 2015 terms. From there, it would have increased with earnings inflation up to 2020, at which point it would start to straight line increase to age 50 at 30,000 Rand per month in 2020 terms. So on the face of it, just reading through that table, it looks like a fair progression. It looks like a progression that makes sense. But when you then go and visually represent this, you can see that the 10,000 Rand in 2015, or in 2010, in today's terms, that's actually around 18,000. So the progression to 12,000 in 2015 terms in 2015, that 12,000 in today's terms is actually only around 16,000. So what the industrial psychologist may have inadvertently postulated here is a decrease in real earnings from 18,000 to 16,000. In addition, yeah, so it's this progression that doesn't necessarily make sense, that a visualization of the progression then helps you to pick up on. So what would make more sense for us in a progression like this is if there was a straight line progression from the date of accident to the date of, to age 50, also without any progression similar to the injured earnings as you saw in the previous slide. It's unlikely that a uninjured progression would follow the same progression as an injured progression, and therefore it would make more sense for that increase to start from the date of accident. So it's these types of these types of things that if you are able to visualize these progressions, that we are hoping it will really help the industrial psychologists to produce progressions that makes more sense. So at this point, I am going to hand over to my colleague Dean, who's going to talk you through this earnings progressions tool. And Dean says that everything is going to be just fine. So I am just going to hand over to him right now.
Thank you, Eddie. Or should I say, Mr. Pollock? That was an economical spell from you, as always. Yeah, so as Eddie said, my name is Dean, or Mitch Johnson if you want, and I'm going to quickly demo the Earnings Assistant application that we've developed and very quickly show you those two examples that Eddie's just walked you through on the Earnings Assistant portal. So just quickly what the Earnings Assistant is, it's a free to use application that we're wanting to make available as from the first week of May next month to industrial psychologists and earnings experts that we hope will enable them to easily convert the narrative of the case, which we very often see that they get right, into a logical basis on which the actuary can do a calculation. So it's that conversion that we find often falls a little bit short, and that's where gaps are created, and that's where vagueness creeps in, And then as the actuaries, and if, you know, in order to quantify it, one has to make assumptions. So we're trying to basically enable and motivate industrial psychologists that when they're doing, you know, finalizing their reports, they're being prompted and enabled to reach the clear outcomes. And what the earnings assistant offers them is it offers them the ability to compare income streams from various different time periods, so that they can compare apples with apples. So as Eddie mentioned earlier, in that case, the 10,000 per month compared to 12,000 per month, the terms of the incomes were different. And initially, it may seem that 12,000 in 2015 terms is more than 10,000, but when one factors in inflation, the impact of inflation, it actually results in a decrease in income. So that's what the platform will offer industrial psychologists. It'll give them the visual guidelines of, you know, here is a visualization of what your postulations are, and is this what you are wanting to say? And if they, you know, if they agree, it also enables them to print out a short synopsis or summary of what their findings are, and they can attach that to their report. Okay. So hopefully, again, sorry to take a step back, why we're wanting to offer this is internally, we find that about 60% of the reports, of the IP reports that we deal with, 60% of those have some form of gap in information. And that's basically our overarching goal, is to try and reduce that number. And so to try promote and encourage industrial psychologists to be clear where they can, and also enable them to know what the actuary needs in their calculations, such that, you know, assumptions don't need to be made. And then hopefully that also means that the overall time taken by the actuary, and, you know, thereafter the settlement process is quicker, which saves money in the long run. Okay, so if I quickly hop over now to the earnings assistant here. Okay. Let's quickly see here. Sorry, let me just make sure. Okay. There we go. So yeah, when you can see here, I've already logged in, and as I said, to save time, I've already pre-populated the earnings assistant with the information that that Eddie had, or the two examples that Eddie had taken you through. Very briefly at the top here, these are just the generic the information of the particular claim that the industrial psychologist could be dealing with at the time. Here, the first table here, if I show you, it's an opportunity for the industrial psychologist to input what the claimant's career history is. So most of you will recognize in most medical legal reports, the industrial psychologist will report on the claimant's career history. So this will give the IP an opportunity to enter the career history, and that can also then be visualized in the graph. In this particular case, we don't have one. So as you can see, nothing's filled in here. I'll skip ahead into the next table here, which allows the industrial psychologist to enter in what has and will happen given the accident. So that's effectively the injured income. And this now allows the industrial psychologist to input every change in income that they foresee from the date of the accident all the way up until retirement there. And in Eddie's example, the particular person, they foresaw 10,000 Rand per month in 2010 terms, which is important, increasing by earnings inflation all the way up until retirement. And the retirement age in this instance was 60. So we can see it's slightly early retirement. There's also an opportunity, and that's one of the other benefits of this, the earnings assistant, is to add benefits. So the industrial psychologist, often, you know, we have to make assumptions, or often we don't have that information. What this will hopefully do and prompt the industrial psychologist to do is ask the right questions when they are in the interview with the claimant, or when they are speaking to the employer, doing the collateral, is they're actually looking for the details of what benefits the claimant was earning or would be earning. So there's an option here. They can click 13th check if the claimant did. They can enter retirement contributions or overtime or allowances, and automatically what this the earnings assistant will do is it will calculate what that is, and it will add it to the total cost to company there for them. Okay. So this was quite a straightforward injured income. It was just 10,000, increasing by inflation up until retirement at age 60. Then here, similarly, what Eddie had inputted, this was the somewhat illogical earnings progression, whereby the 10,000 per month in 2010 terms was increased, even though it was a decrease, to 12,000 per month in 2015 terms. There's an option here for each career progression, so the injured income or uninjured income. There's an option to view what the what the graphical representation is in isolation. And here you can see when you hover over each point here, you can actually see what that income is, the monthly income is in present monetary terms. And you can see, what age the claimant will be at the various dates. So immediately, just looking at this graph and just hovering over the figures, you can see that the 18,141 Rand in current terms actually decreases to the 16,167. So, when you're busy checking, has the as the IP has the postulation that I have currently put down, does that make sense? Is it logical? Immediately there you should say, oh, that is a decrease. Is that what I'm wanting to say or not? And if not, you can quickly adjust it, either change the terms here or you can delete the row. Okay. And then at the bottom of the earnings assistant here, you've got an overall visualization of the entire case. So because we hadn't put in any career history, the graph just starts from the date of accident. Obviously, if you do input a career history, you would see the career history there before the accident. And this then tells you the accidents here. We are here today. You can see the uninjured progression there slightly lower than the injured progression. And that immediately should raise an alarm bell and say, oh, okay, that's a net gain as opposed to a loss. But ignoring that, if we look forward here, you can see the loss is obviously the difference between the injured and the uninjured. You can quickly see there's early retirement here. So that's hopefully the benefit that the industrial psychologist or whoever uses this platform will get immediately. There's the other function here that once you're happy with how you've inputted the specifics of the case, there's an export function, and that will give you a very quick 2-page printout. So the first page will be the table itself of this is what you've said. So the factual earnings to date, there's no income available, no career history. Here is the injured income effectively. We're saying that the date of accident was then, this is the income that we're using and the retirement age. And this you can print and attach it, well, you being the IP can print it and attach it to their report if they want as an annexure, or they can copy the information and actually insert it into the body of their report. The second page is the graph. So obviously, if you want to include the graph in your report or include it in the annexure, you can also similarly, if you print this out as a PDF, you can see here, that shows you that it's printable as a PDF there immediately. So that's in a nutshell, very, very, very quick spell from me, but that's in a nutshell the value that we're hoping to bring to the industrial psychologist industry. And yeah, the launch date, as I said, would be the first week of May, and it's going to be free to use. So effectively, again, our goal here is to empower and try and motivate industrial psychologists to reach clear outcomes, which will ultimately, improve the efficiency of the entire claims process. So that's the big goal here. Okay, I'll now hand over, well, another change of bowlers. I'll change back to Eddie to take you through the Q&A session. Cool, thanks guys.
Perfect pace on that delivery, Dean. Well done. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. 28 minutes past 2, that's not too bad for timing. I'm just going to now leave some time to answer any questions that any of you might have. I'm just going to pull up my question and answer window here, and it doesn't look like there's any questions at this stage, but I'm just going to give it another minute or two. Maybe while we wait, what I can also mention is that we've got another 4 webinars scheduled for next week. So please come and join us for those as well. You should have the links to those in the invite that was sent originally. I see there's a question that has come through here. Can an IP make contact with us to talk about the earnings assistant? Dean, can I hand that one over to you?
Yes, thanks. Very good question there. Yeah, so we will be sharing our contact details there. So I think the preferred method, the preferred form of contact will be via email for now. So I would encourage you to get hold of your industrial psychologists and ask them to get in touch with us. So that we have their details on record for when the first week of May, when we launch it, we will get in touch with them and give them all the details to use this platform. Good question.
Okay. Just going to give it another minute or maybe a little less to see if there's any other questions that pop up. It doesn't look like it. Let me also just go to the little chat section and see if there's anything in there. I think we've dealt with all of those. So it doesn't look like there's any more questions. If you do have questions that you think about afterwards, please email us. Our email address is up on the screen right now. That's our full team, and we would love to see you online again for the rest of the series, or otherwise catch up with you soon. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for joining. I hope that it's been informative, and I hope that you've got a wonderful Easter weekend ahead, and that lockdown ends for us all next week sometime. Keep well. Cheers.